So today is about five things that you can ask your board for. On Tuesday, we're going to be doing the workshop on compliance. So obviously, Stephanie, I know you have a nonprofit. That'll be really helpful for you and anyone who doesn't have a nonprofit but wants to see how the compliance piece works. We're going to be going over like filing your annual forms because anyone who has a nonprofit and your fiscal year ends in December, your annual forms are due June 15th. So I was trying to wait until after personal tax season to dive into the nonprofit annual forms so that people could kind of put the personal tax stuff aside. So that link, if you need it, let me know. I think some of you have it. That one I set up to automatically send to your calendars. Stephanie, did that work for you? I think I sent you the link for that the other day.
Yes, I have
Cool.
that. And I hadn't seen that come around. So thank you. And yeah, I'll be able to make
Cool.
that meeting. Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Sure. Okay, with that, I'm going to dive into today's training. So welcome. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Dr. Lauren Lawson. I help therapists start nonprofit therapy practices. And one snippet that I often forget to share with people, mostly because I just forget, is that I actually have 7 different certificates in nonprofit leadership and one specifically in running boards. So that's where I pulled a lot of my information from, is from the program that I did. I mean, this was a long time ago, but it was through the University of Notre Dame. If anyone's interested in doing that program, it was super valuable and helpful. Um, and I also have a certificate in organizational psychology. So a lot of what I'm pulling from is from not only my experience, but my education background, and then executing that myself with my own nonprofit. So, if you're on this call, most likely you've already done a lot of the hard part, and you saw a need in your community. And instead of waiting for someone else to fix it, you built something yourself, so that you could make sure that your community got its needs met. And if you're like most of the founders that I work with, you're also a clinician. You're a therapist first, which means nobody ever sat you down and taught you how to run a board. So today we're going to talk exactly about that, and I'm going to give you 5 specific things um, that high functioning nonprofit founders ask their board for. So it's not theory. I'm pulling this from some of the research that is done out there on boards and applying it specifically to therapist-led nonprofits. So before I dive into it, I just want to get a quick read. You can put a number in the chat. On a scale from 1 to 10, how energized do you actually feel walking into a board meeting? Um, one is, and there's no judgment, one is like, I'd rather do anything else than run a board meeting or be in a board meeting. And 10 means you pretty much get fired up and you're super excited for it. So I kind of want to know how people feel because when I talk to therapists, this and fundraising are the parts that come up and invoke a lot of fear or self-doubt for them. So I'll say usually I'm at like a 5. I've definitely been at a 1 most of the time in my life. So I'm curious where you all fall on that 1 to 10 scale. An 8. Oh, that's awesome. I would love to hear more about that. Maybe if we have time at the end that you leave feeling energized. That is a good sign that you have a great board. So, okay, let's see. Oh, I also wanted to, let me see if I can grab it. I created a handbook that goes along with this training so that you guys can, let me see if I could just pull it up though real quick, that you guys can follow along with me here. Did my screen change or are you still seeing the PowerPoint?
No problem.
Okay, that's okay. Just give me a minute. Where did I save this? Yeah, I have a handout for everybody. And if you're watching the replay, you can email me or comment workbook or handout and I'll send it to you. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put it in the chat for everybody now, if it lets me send it. Okay, let me know if you're able to open that link. Ah, no. Okay. Okay. And you should now be seeing the PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
Looks like it. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I thought I had that link up. So click on that link. You guys should be able to access it. It's the handout that goes with today because I'm going to give you some specific scripts to talk to your board about. So hopefully that will help. And if you have questions throughout, pop it in the comments and I'm going to leave room for questions at the end. And then, of course, you can always email me after too if you have questions that come up. So with that, let's go ahead. So this is a little bit about what you're going to walk away with today. We're not really doing a lecture. This is 5 specific things, the exact things that you can ask your board for, that a lot of founders struggle with because they just don't have the language to do it. So I'm going to give you the actual scripts that you can use and like what category they fall into within like the board's role and what they're supposed to be doing. We're also going to tackle some beliefs about asking for things from your board, because if your belief is off, then every ask you make will kind of feel awkward and uncomfortable. So here's the first belief that we're going to talk about. Most therapist founders, and I definitely fell into this too, quietly believe that your board exists to approve what you're already doing, right? To give it the blessing, to kind of nod along and vote yes, and not get in the way. So board meetings end up becoming, a full out report rather than an open conversation. So it's more of like, here's what we did, here's the budget. Any questions? Great. See you next meeting. 30 minutes done, and then it kind of starts to feel like your board is very passive. And then when you kind of develop that style of relationship, then it makes it hard to ask your board for things that you might need from them that could really help move the organization forward. So that's not really what a board is for. This comes straight from board source. If you're not familiar with it, you can Google it and then pin it. It's one of the national authorities on nonprofit governance. They lay out 10 responsibilities of a nonprofit board. And when you step back, every single one of those responsibilities falls into 3 buckets. So we're going to go over those 3 buckets. A board exists to do these 3 jobs. That's set direction, secure resources, and provide oversight. Strategy, money, and accountability. That's the whole job of the board. So, what do they really mean? Setting direction is about the mission and the strategy, making sure there's a real plan for where the organization is going, not where it's been, about looking ahead. Securing resources means making sure the money and the relationships exist to actually do the work. And to notice that the board's job too is not only yours to do this. And then providing oversight is about the guardianship piece. This is oversight of financial, legal, and ethical. It's not about being in the day-to-day operations of the nonprofit. It also includes supporting you and really honestly evaluating you as a leader. So those are the 3 buckets that the 10 responsibilities from Board Source fall into: strategy, money, and accountability. So we're going to utilize these 3 responsibilities to actually ask our board for things that we need. Okay, so here's what your board is not. Your board is not a clinical supervisor. They're not a panel assembled to second guess your treatment model. It's not extra staff for you to manage on top of everything else. They operate outside of you. They hold the responsibility of the board. And to be honest, I have found over the years it is helpful when I'm not the board president because then I don't have to be responsible for the board either. The president is. And so I'm vice president of my board and I rely on my president to do that. And again, it's not a rubber stamp that's about, meets, you nod, and you leave. We don't want your board to operate that way. So when a board drifts into clinical weeds, when they start questioning how you deliver therapy, or when they go completely silent and contribute nothing, That is almost never a character flaw in your board members. It's a signal, and it means that the real asks were never made clearly. So they fill the empty space with whatever feels familiar or safe to them. So, um, and I say this with love, it is your job, or your job is not to make your board comfortable. Your job is to make them useful. And useful always starts with a clear ask. So that's what this whole workshop is really designed around. And I felt like this piece was important to go over before we dive into that or to talk about those asks. And I think it's also important to take blame off your shoulders because there's a reason that therapist-led boards become passive. It's structural and it usually starts from day one. Some of you can probably think back to when you formed your board. And I remember when I did, you needed 3 names to file your 501(c)(3) paperwork. You had a deadline. You probably were working on 100 other things. So you called the people that you trusted, a colleague, your old clinical supervisor, maybe a friend from grad school, maybe a cousin who's good with numbers, or some other family member. Basically, people who believed in you and said yes because they wanted you to succeed. That is not an uncommon experience. If you haven't heard of Joan Gary, she's a really well-known governance expert. I highly recommend following her on Instagram. She has a Facebook group as well. I believe it's called the Nonprofit Hub. She talks about nonprofits in general. They're not specific to therapy practices, but she is a governance expert and she writes for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And she calls this Make Way for the Ducklings Board. So this is, that children's book where the mother duck marches across Boston and all the ducklings fall in line right behind her. That's the picture, right? You're the lead duck. You recruited people to follow you, so they follow. When your board feels passive, they're not failing you. They're being exactly who you asked them to be on day one, and nobody ever changed the job description from there. But here's what's important to know about that is, and we'll come back to this a couple times today, a passive board is almost never a people problem. It's an unmade ask. And the beautiful thing about an unmade ask is that it's completely fixable. You just have to do it. And so we're going to talk about how do you actually do that. And there's a second piece to this that I see come up all the time. And that is a lot of us therapists, these are, other founders of nonprofits, and I see it in myself, is we end up with founders syndrome. It's a textbook version of when the founder holds on so tightly that the organization can't grow past them. Um, and here's what most people get wrong about it. Founder syndrome it's not about ego. It's not about selfishness or selfishness. Underneath it, almost always, it's actually fear. And it shows up in a lot of the decisions that you make, like being reluctant to write down your processes or redoing your team's work because it isn't quite how you do it. And maybe it shows up differently for you. I think it looks different for everybody. Um, but at the end of the day, it runs deep for therapists because the work feels personal to us. It's relational. It's your name, it's your license attached to a lot of it. And so you genuinely care about the humans that you're serving on the other end. And so you don't want to sacrifice quality. So I'm not telling you to care less. Obviously, that would be terrible advice, but to fix the founder syndrome is building a board strong enough to be a real partner, strong enough of like being able to let go so that it doesn't feel like something else is going to drop. It feels like handing it to someone that you trust. And so that's what I built these 5 asks around. So let's go through them. So ask number 1 is the one that makes therapists almost like crawl under the table. I have this conversation lately, I think like 5 times a week, and it's about money, or more precisely, helping secure the resources to like keep your doors open. And I can, understand why that makes us so tense. We're probably not in a position of asking for people money directly. Even though we have had to work through this when we're asking our clients for money and to pay for services, right? But it feels different when you're asking a board. So here's the mistake that I see founders make, and it goes usually one of two ways. Either they never bring money up with the board at all, it feels rude, so they just quietly carry like all the fundraising alone, or they swing to the opposite extreme and treat their board members like human ATMs. I don't think I've ever really seen that in my work. I've seen that in other larger nonprofits that I've worked at or been associated with. And so it's sometimes that's like just go write the big checks or ask rich people for money and then leave me to do the real work. I've definitely seen that. Both of those end up failing. They fail for the same reason. They misunderstand what a board fundraising actually is. So ensuring the organization has adequate resources is one of the responsibilities of a board. Board Source, the resource I mentioned earlier, lists write it alongside strategy and oversight. So it's not a bonus. It is not only your job as the executive director, it is formally part of what it means to sit on a board. But here's what I want you to know is that and this comes from actually research from Blue Avocado. If you're not familiar with Blue Avocado, it's another reputable resource out there for executive directors. Um, is that most of your board members were never actually told that supporting fundraising is part of the role. So the answer isn't to expect more, it's really to educate and to update your job description if it's not in there. So here's the key idea. It's not about your board being rich, it's about them opening the doors. Single highest value thing a board member can do is rarely it's not just writing the check, right? It's the introduction they make. One warm introduction from a board member to the right person can outperform a year of you sending cold emails into the void. So it doesn't mean that you're necessarily directly asking for money. But here's our challenge as therapists. We're trained to give, we're trained to hold space, not to impose, to put other people's needs first. So asking anyone for money can feel like it violates the very thing that makes us good clinicians. And your board, if they're clinicians too, or just kind people who care, they feel the exact same hesitation. Um, so I know asking for money feels uncomfortable. It does for me too. Um, and so even saying that specifically, just how I said it to you guys, you saying that to your board can lower the temperature. So that's something that you can say to them and to acknowledge and to validate. And here's the other thing. A board member never has to make the actual ask if they don't want to. They just have to make the introduction. And then you can take it from there. Or if you have a fundraising expert, they can take it from there. You can give them the tools and then hand them, you should all have like an impact talking point for them to kind of be able to give out or, make the introduction to somebody. They should have that in I always create for my board like a board guidebook and talking points of what we do so that they can go out and talk to people about what we do and then make an introduction, right? So here's exactly how you say it to your board, and this should be in the handout that you have. And you can obviously tailor this but I like full scripts. It helps me really practice and like memorize and hype myself up for something I want to say. So here's the script. I want to be really clear about what I'm asking and what I'm not. I'm not asking you to write a check. I'm not asking you to put the touch on your friends. What I am asking each of you is for two things this quarter. One introduction to one person who should know our work exists, and one moment where you tell our story in a room that I will never be in. And I want to give you the exact words to use so that you never have to wing it, right? And then you can give them the information. You can make it concrete as a verbal yes evaporates and a simple resource expectation to your board agreement. For example, every board commits to a set of number of introductions per year, right? You can add that in and you can pair it with a one-page tell our story card that they can keep so that they can reference it before they actually talk to people. So when the ask is specific and the tools are in their hands so that they know how to execute that ask that you're wanting them to do, the hesitant board members who don't like talking about money suddenly feel more equipped to actually have that conversation. So let's dive into ask number two. And again, if you have any questions throughout this, let me know. So ask number two is what I call altitude. You want your board operating at 30,000 feet above, looking out at the horizon, at where this organization should be in 3 years. That's the idea. Not down in the weeds, not in the operations of your clinical model, your scheduling software, whether the waiting room should be repainted or what your wait list is looking like. That's not where the board lives. They're not in the forest. They're not in the trees. They're above the forest, above 30,000 feet, looking at the future forest, right? And so you can visualize like a plane above there. That's usually what I kind of do. So here's a pattern I want you to notice with that though. When you don't give a board a strategic job to do, um they go quiet, right? They go small. Um, they end up operating inside of a vacuum. And so then each person ends up doing that on the board. So if you don't hand them a question worthy of their altitude, they will start debating the logo, the color of the brochure, which software to buy. And it's so easy to get frustrated with them for that. And that's not their fault. You just didn't give them anything bigger to chew on. So that's what we're going to talk about with this second ask. So ensuring effective planning is talking about it explicitly in the board's lane. It's right there in their core responsibilities. Strategy is one thing a board is uniquely positioned to do. They have outside perspective. They're not buried in the day to day, and they can see the forest while you're in the trees. And you need that because we all know what it's like to be in the weeds. We sometimes can't see the bigger picture because we have to call to get this claim paid, or we have to um, refill out another application that we already did and got denied. So we're focused on all of those things to keep it going operationally, but you also need someone to understand the bigger picture, and that's what they're to help you do. Um, so Blue Avocado points this out beautifully, in my opinion. The single best tool for clarifying the relationship between you and your board is strategic planning. When you plan together, it naturally sorts out who owns what. The board stops drifting into management because they can finally have their own meaningful work. People commit to what they help build. So when your board helps shape the 3 year vision, they stop being passengers and start becoming like co-owners of the mission. And that's what we want. So I need to take a drink of water real quick because my allergies have been so crazy. There's a therapist trap that we end up in because we're so protective of clinical quality, as we should be. Our instinct is to pull every decision back to ourselves. We become actually the bottleneck for everything, big and small, right? But strategy is actually the one place where you want your board leaning in all the way. Because if you're the only one thinking about the future of the organization, then you're the single point of failure. And that is really heavy to own, right? Letting the board own the strategy doesn't weaken your control over what matters. It protects you from being the only brain in the building. This came up recently with my board. I heard of this opportunity um, uh, that came up, and this was something new that I learned is that another nonprofit that I knew, another nonprofit therapy practice in the same county that we've been operating in was selling their a branch of their nonprofit, which one, I didn't know that you could do that until recently. Two, when I heard about that opportunity, I was like, should we consider purchasing that branch? And what would that look like? And I knew that I could obviously not make that decision alone. And that was a bigger strategy question, right? Like, what does it mean to buy part of another nonprofit? What does the cost look like? What does it mean to obtain their assets? Assets are considered clinicians, clients, office space, contracts, like all of that stuff. And so I brought it to my board, and they were able to see the bigger vision that I couldn't see. I have been so focused on growing my nonprofit in PA and in California that they were like, let's take a pause and really think about this and what this means for you. And my board member, Navjot, she actually started her own nonprofit in Northern California a couple years ago, and she's been booming. And she said, Lauren, I have to tell you, we opened a second location and we are experiencing all kinds of problems opening that location that's taking up a ton of our time and space. And she was like, I know that you mentioned a few months ago that you wanted to take Wednesdays and Fridays off in the summer to spend with your kids. And I think that if you end up buying this nonprofit, she's like, that's not going to happen. And your work in PA is going to have to take a pause because you don't know these clinicians. You're going to have to go out to California and meet with them and orient them and take on all the ins and outs of that. And so we talked about strategically the pros and cons of either growing naturally, organically in California or um or buying this branch of the nonprofit. And I was so grateful for that conversation because I can get stuck in like, yes, let's do it right now. That sounds so great. And they were like, well, we need to hold the phone a second. Is this really what you want? And so we took it to a vote and we decided not to do it. And I could not be more grateful now that summer is here. And next week, I'm like, oh my God, I could not imagine not having the summer with my kids that I wanted to have. So that's an example of helping them hold this strategy for you and can help you. So let's talk about how to say this out loud into what you actually say to your board. So I don't need you to weigh on how we deliver therapy. That's my team's clinical expertise, and that's the one place that I always hold the line. What I need from you, and obviously you can word this however you feel comfortable, but be firm. What I need from you is something I genuinely can't do alone. I need altitude. Help me answer the questions that keep me up at night. Where should this organization be in 3 years? And what has to be true for us to actually get there? And then change one thing about your very next meeting when you think about putting this into place. Put one strategic question, not an operational update, at the very top of the agenda. Give the board the full 30 minutes on it before a single report gets read. So, whatever comes first on your agenda is what your board believes is its job. So, if reports come first, they think their job is to receive the reports. Put strategy first and watch what happens. And then I'm really curious if you do this, let me know how it goes. So again, I did this at my last board meeting and it was really, really powerful for me. It was that question that I brought of how are we going to expand? Do we want to do it naturally and organically and grow slower, or do we want to buy a fully operating team and inherit that? So let's go into the next question or the next kind of ask that you want to give your board. Did it switch? Does it still say altitude on your end? Hmm. Okay, hold on one second. See, anyone else's Zoom change recently? Mine did. Sorry about this. Hold on. Okay. I gotta reopen my Google Slides here and go to the slide that we were at. Okay. I think it got messed up when I went to get that other link. Didn't realize it. Okay, here we go. Okay, now you should be able to see the third one, right? And if I click back, does it change for you guys? Yeah, it did. Okay. I just want to make sure the PowerPoint's working correctly. Doing it on Zoom this way is new. Okay, so let's go to number three. I think this one takes a lot of courage. So think about this. Ask your board to be an honest mirror, to actually evaluate you, right? This one's hard, to give you real feedback, to hold you accountable, including the parts that are hard to hear. I know that every instinct is screaming probably the opposite, like, "Ooh, do I really want to hear that?" Of course, our instinct is to keep our board comfortable, admiring, and, on your side. But I really want you to sit with this. A board that only ever tells you you're doing a good job is not really actually protecting you. It's leaving you completely alone. And the clearest sign of a follower board, and this is Joan Gary's word, not mine, is that it never offers the founder an honest assessment. And so they're loyal to you, they're so loyal to you that they've stopped being useful to you, right? So supporting and evaluating the chief executive is, again, a named responsibility of the board. And notice it's both words, support and evaluate. They come as a package. A board that supports you but never evaluates you is only doing half its job. And it's the more comfortable half. Let's be honest about that. So here's why this is the most single powerful list ask on our list today is because it's a real performance review, especially one that quietly includes input from your staff. And I'm going to be rolling this out. I haven't done this yet, so I'm going to be doing this same thing in my next board meeting. It's that time of year, and I'm going to ask my board to really truly give me an honest performance eval because we have changed significantly over the last year. We've grown a lot. So it's a direct antidote to the founder syndrome that we identified in the beginning of the presentation. So if you remember, the founder syndrome grows in the dark, in the blind spots that we can't see in ourselves. It's a genuine review that drags those blind spots into the light while they're still small and fixable, instead of letting them grow into things that caps your organization's growth, or burns out your team or burns you out, right? That's a big piece here. So here's the beautiful, to me, irony for us therapists. We are world class at giving feedback. Hopefully, if you're doing clinical supervision well, we do it all day, not just in clinical supervision, but with our clients. So, as many of us are surprisingly terrible at receiving it about our own leadership, because as a founder, no one's been maybe brave enough to give it to us. So, we want to model the thing that you're good at. Go first. Ask for the feedback that you're most afraid of. When you do that, you give your entire board and your staff permission to be honest, and you break the spell of the follower board. I think this is really helpful, not only for your board, but for your staff as well. I don't remember where it came from, like the actual source, but one of the things that I remember from organizational psychology is that the healthiest teams have the space and they feel safe enough to give their leader feedback. So we kind of want it to go both ways. We want it to come from the bottom up and the top down. And that's in terms of communication too, bottom up communication, top down communication. And if you have like a charismatic hands-on leadership style, which a lot of clinicians do and a lot of clinicians don't, um, these traits that end up making you a magnetic founder can quietly shrink the space of your staff to grow and lead. So you want to make room for that. So it's really a 360 style review, one that introduces your team's voice, and then your board's voice as well. And in fact, there's a book called 360 Degrees Leadership and Management, and I highly recommend that book. Also, if you have not read any of Patrick Leoncioni's books, it gives a really great view of organizational leadership and psychology as well. Okay, so let's get into what to say to your board. I want to ask the board for something that's genuinely uncomfortable for me. Once a year, I'd like a real evaluation of my leadership, and I want it to include honest input from my staff, gathered confidentially. I'm not fishing for applause. I'm asking for the truth because I never want this organization to be limited by a blind spot of mine that nobody felt safe enough to name. Will the board take ownership of that process? Then you can make it real before the meeting ends. Put one annual leadership review on the calendar right now with a date. Ask your board chair to own it, not you, and build in a simple, confidential way for your staff to weigh in. You can actually do this through a Google form. Um, some of you, I'm not sure if you've ever created a Google form, but I just recently learned how to do it, and whoa, it's been life-changing. This is just like a side tip. You can get Google Workspace for free as a nonprofit, and then you can sign a BAA with Google Workspace, and you can use all of your team emails through that. But you can also create Google Forms, forms for clients. And sometimes Google Forms are a little bit complicated to create because you have to have like coding behind the scenes, especially if you want answers to go to a spreadsheet. But you can just ask AI to create you the code for the Google form and what you want on there. So you could do, that's one way that your board president can get answers from your staff. If you have staff, is to set up a Google form that's anonymous. And then the president can utilize that to create the review. Um, I forget where I was at in this. Oh, so yeah, so basically a confidential way for your staff to weigh in. So the act of scheduling it is what actually separates founders who mean it from the founders who mean it from the founders who just talk about doing this. So again, this is not something that I have done, and I've really been so in the weeds that I haven't thought about the larger picture. And I've realized I am a part of that, and I really do want the feedback. So this is something that I've asked my board to do, and we're going to be doing it. We just haven't executed it yet. The other three questions I have done with my board, and it's been very helpful. Okay, so we're on number four. I know I feel like I'm talking a lot. Number four is guardianship. This is asking your board to truly own the financial and legal oversight of the organization. So protecting its assets, watching compliance, reading the financials like it's their actual job because it is really their job. It doesn't mean that they are creating the financial spreadsheets. A bookkeeper should be doing that, or maybe you're still doing that, but they should absolutely be asking for financials and looking at them prior to every board meeting. I send my board the monthly financials, so they see it monthly. And so I want to talk about founders who end up staying awake at 2 in the morning um, because you're the one who signed the lease, right? You're the one who's worrying about the Form 990. You're the one watching the bank account balance. You're the one doing the math on the payroll. And so here's the hard truth. Most of the therapist-led nonprofit founders are carrying all of that completely alone, and their board has no idea because they never ask them to share the weight. So I know that that can feel maybe sometimes noble. Maybe sometimes it also feels very overwhelming, like you're protecting everyone else from the stress. But in my opinion, it's not noble. It is one of the single points of failure that I mentioned earlier. So if something happens to you, the whole thing ends up wobbling, right? Protecting the organization's assets, providing financial oversight, and ensuring the legal and ethical integrity. Those are the core fiduciary duties of the board. The fiduciary duties of the board that is required. That's a legal word that means they're obligated to do this. So it's just not a favor when they look at finances. It is literally the reason the board exists. So strong financial oversight is also one of the structural things that keeps founder syndrome from becoming existential risk to the whole organization. When the board genuinely owns oversight, two good things happen at once. The organization gets a real safety net, and you get freed up to actually lead the mission instead of being the only backstop for every single thing that could go wrong. So, most of us in this room went to school for counseling, for social work, psychology. We did not take accounting. And if you're me, you are not good at math and maybe you failed statistics because I definitely did. And so clinician founders are often have like the least financial training and not coincidentally the most financial fear, right? Like we don't do math to be a therapist. Um, so handling real financial oversight is um, or handing it over to a committee for financial oversight is not losing control. It's finally getting the safety net that you've never had. Now, I've learned over the years to do the basics because I had to for a lot of the higher up jobs that I've had. So I feel like I got on the job training with it. But it is a huge task and burden to go through, every single piece of revenue and every single piece of operating costs and do all of that myself. It is so much better when I handed that off to a bookkeeper and then identified someone on my board to be the one who has experience with finances to be the oversight. So for me on my board, a woman does it who she's not a therapist, but she's worked in nonprofit leadership as executive director for 30 plus years. So she was the person who I handed this over to really be like, hey, can you help me make sure I'm understanding the finances and we're operating in a way that's sustainable for us? So if you end up looking around your board and you realize that not one person can confidently read a nonprofit financial statement, that's not a reason to just keep doing it how it is, and to do it alone. That's information. So that tells you exactly who your next board member really needs to be. And don't forget, compliance for a therapy nonprofit is real and specific, and that the compliance piece is linked to the financial piece, right? The annual compliance forms, which we're going over next week, are directly linked to the finances. That's what we're reporting on. That's in the annual report, and that's what is absolutely required, or else you're at risk for losing your status. So, your board's oversight job explicitly includes making sure those guardrails actually exist. So here's what you can say to your board. I need to be honest with all of you. I've been carrying the financial and legal weight of the organization mostly by myself, and I've come to see that it's a risk to all of us, not just to me. So I'm asking the board to truly own oversight. That means reviewing our financials at every single meeting, making sure we're staying compliant and actively protecting this organization's assets. I'm not looking for, an audience for my reports. I'm looking for real partners in this. And then you can build in the structure that makes your words stick. So you can set up a finance committee or revive maybe one that exists on paper, with at least one member who can genuinely read a balance sheet. So if you're not familiar with committees, they're often smaller groups that break out from the board, and it's a committee specifically designed for a purpose. So you might have a fundraising committee that's typically led by a board member, and they might recruit volunteers to be on that committee, such as fundraising, but there's also often financial committees. And basically committees meet outside board meetings, right? So if you set up a financial committee and you have someone from your board, not you, overseeing that financial committee, then they take responsibility for setting up the meeting, bringing the agenda, and leading the meeting. So it doesn't have to be, a huge committee. It could be you and that person taking responsibility. Maybe it's you, that person on your board, and your bookkeeper or your CPA, and have those meetings quarterly, whatever is needed. But this should be done when you're thinking about your financial projections for the upcoming years, right? Because that's looking 30,000 feet in the air, not at the weeds. And so sometimes, the final ask in this is the hardest one emotionally, but to me, it's the truest test of whether you've built something that lasts. So let's talk about the last question. So this has two halves to it. I'm going to give you both because they belong together. The first half is to ask your board to be ambassadors. The second half, and this is the one that we all avoid, like nothing else, is to ask them to help you build a future that doesn't depend on you. So let's take the first half. Blue avocado, which I've mentioned before, um, has a line that I love. Shift your board from a board of directors to a board of ambassadors. Your board members should be out in their own networks, consistently telling your story, enhancing the organization's public standing. Once again, a named board responsibility. They are your most credible messengers, and more credible than you are because they're on the board and they have nothing to gain by talking about you because they're volunteers, right? Ambassadorship is often the lowest fear, like on ramp to engagement that exists. A nervous board member doesn't have to fundraise. They don't have to read a balance sheet. They don't have to make a hard ask for money. They just have to share a story that moved them about your organization. So if you have some board members that are timid, this is where you start with them, with framing it as ambassadorship and going out to represent your organization. It builds the muscle and the confidence for some of those harder ones, right? So let's talk about the second half, succession. This has to be a part of the board. Um, and so a board that genuinely cannot imagine the organization surviving without you is not a sign of how special you are. It's the single biggest risk your organization carries. Legitimate succession planning, this is Joan Gary's phrase, where legitimate is the key word, is the ultimate antidote to founder syndrome. It's the honest test of whether you've built an organization or just very demanding job with your name on it. So I know why this one, stings for us specifically because as therapist founders, we usually are the face and the heart of the practice. It was our vision. We brought it to life. Clients come because of us. So planning the future without us can feel like abandonment, kind of like we're betraying the people or our parts of us who trusted us. So here's a reframe that I want you to walk away with. Planning for the future is the most caring thing you could possibly do for your clients and your staff. Real legacy is not being irreplaceable. Real legacy is building something solid that outlives you and keeps serving people long after you have moved on. And this is also straight from Joan Gary. If you truly believe in the organization, if you truly believe the organization cannot survive without you, then that is exactly the work. And it is so much kinder to yourself and everyone else to start it now while it's a calm choice rather than later when it's a crisis, right? You don't want to be approaching retirement and not have a succession plan in place because your clients rely on the organization, your staff are relying on income. You are, if you're a group, you're training future therapists to work in the field. And if you suddenly retire and don't have any plan, like that's a crisis situation. At that point, the organization should not be functioning solely on you. This is something that I've started to think about in my organization for sure. We haven't done succession planning yet, but I have had an idea in my mind for my successor and what I want that to look like, and what the options are because I don't want to be working, my whole life. I do want to have a retirement plan and I don't want to have to panic about that retirement plan. Or if God forbid something happened to me, right? Because that's just life and our mortality is always in our face. So for me, I built this organization because I do want it to be a legacy. And so we have to plan for that. So here's what you can say to your board. I have two asks. They go together. The first one is easy. I want everyone to be our ambassadors, telling our story in the rooms that I will never get to walk into. The second one is harder. I want to name that. I want us to start building an organization that thrives even when I'm not the one running it. And I want to be clear about what that is and what that isn't. That is not me leaving. That is me loving this mission enough to make sure it outlives any one of us, including me. So then you can take small first steps to actually execute this because obviously this is way too big to solve in one meeting. You want to give every board member one specific ambassador story to share this quarter. And separately, put succession and sustainability on a future agenda. You don't have to solve it now. You don't have to talk about it in the current meeting, but just naming it and putting it on the calendar is step one. Um, and most that founders never end up taking. All right, so let's bring it all home with the five asks and the five things that high functioning founders ask their board for. Number one, money and open doors. Number two is the altitude, right? So that's the strategy, not clinical micromanaging. Number three is an honest mirror, right? Real feedback and accountability about you. as the executive director. Number four is guardianship, so the financial and legal oversight. And then number five is ambassadorship. And that's building a future that's bigger than you. So what these things all have one thing in common. Every one of them starts with you making a clear ask. That's the whole secret to this. A passive board is almost never a people problem. Again, it goes back to that unmade ask. So founders who have board members that show up, contribute, and carry the weight with them aren't lucky. They just didn't magically get that. It's because they've learned the right things to ask them and to involve them and help them take ownership. So I want to give you one move this week. It's not all five, but pick the single ask that would change the most for you right now and make it. And if you feel up for sharing it, I would love to hear it in the chat. You don't have to fix everything, but what would be the one ask that you would want to start with? If you feel comfortable, pop it in the chat. If you don't, just reflect on it. For me, I have two. I think, like I mentioned, it is I want the real feedback from my staff and my board. Um, and I do want to start building a succession plan. I think it's time, and we're now big enough for that to happen. Not that you have to be big to do that, but right now it would be a real problem if something happened to me. Ah, the guardianship piece, improving my asks. Yeah. Yeah, the guardianship one is hard. I think that one only came easier to me because I had to be in financials in my other roles. And so it was easier to ask my board about it. I don't know why, but that isn't one that I get stuck on. It is definitely the feedback for me. But I'm really happy that you shared that. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to share real quick that I do have a pretty big launch coming up in the next week and a half. I'm launching something called the Therapist Nonprofit Framework. It drops June 1st. It's a mini course series that goes over four phases of building a nonprofit therapy practice. Phase one is formation, phase two is governance, phase three is revenue, and phase four is implementation. If you're interested in getting on the wait list, I'm going to put the wait list in the chat. It doesn't matter if you've been through my programs before. This is all updated new information and templates that you can use. And they're really affordable. So each phase is regularly priced at 125, but during the launch phase, it's going to be 97, and then you can get the whole bundle for 297. So it's updated things that you haven't seen before. It's things that you get to keep. And let me see if I can find my chat list. My chat, I have a wait list that you can sign up for. The wait list doesn't mean that you have to buy it, just means that you are interested in it and you want me to send you that launch coupon code for 97 for each course.